The federal government released national greenhouse gas emissions data today, updated for 2022, the latest year available. And there were no surprises, which in effect is a surprise. There isn't much going on in the way of GHG reduction in this country. And the oil and gas in particular, which is an interest of Energy Media, is leading the way in being a laggard. So I'm going to talk to MC Bouchard, who is the program director of oil and gas for Pembina Institute, about those numbers. So welcome to the interview, MC.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's start at the national level. Where are we at relative to past data?
Great. Well, first of all, it's nice to see the 2022 data, which is essentially all free of any COVID impact, as we've been talking about. So really gives us a better understanding of where we're at. Good to see that there is some reduction across some of the sectors from 2019. I think one to point out, which I think should be a success story for Canada, is around the electricity sector and coal abatement, making a big difference in terms of total emissions, right? I think there's some positive. I think there's also some caution in terms of, I think as you alluded to, what we're looking at right now doesn't necessarily align us on track to get to our 2030 targets. So that's the caution that we have.
Right. Now, in 2021, Canada had 670 megatons of CO2 equivalent. That was our national emissions total. Now it's 708. So I help my viewers understand how that's actually a good thing, seeing as how we appear to have gone up 38 megatons in 1 year.
Right. Well, I guess if you compare to 2021, which is generally accepted, and we've done the analysis to have been impacted by COVID. So people were still traveling less. People, were using different modes of living, if we can call it that. So I think we would agree to say that 21 data were artificially low given COVID. So that's why we are looking at comparing more so that would be apples to apples, comparing 2019 to 2022 data.
Okay, let's talk about oil and gas emissions at the national level. And so the big producers are gas in British Columbia. Alberta is the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, of Canadian oil and gas. It leads in both oil and gas production. Saskatchewan has mostly oil, but there's associated gas. That's gas that's produced with the oil. And then, of course, you have oil in Newfoundland and Labrador. So in 2014, there were 230 megatons per year of emissions from this industry. And 8 years later, in 2022, 217. So a reduction over the course of almost a decade of only 13 megatons. I would have to say, as a Canadian, that's pretty disappointing.
Yes, I think we'd have to agree with that. We're not seeing the progress that we need to be seeing across the oil and gas industry. There's some positive. I mean, it's a little bit hidden in the data, I would say, Markham, but we do know that there has been some methane emissions reduction across the sector. I think we have to give some credit where credit is due. But again, some of the reductions from methane abatement are actually being offset by increases in the oil sands industry in Alberta, right? So that is why, that is a big reason why we're not seeing the progress that we should be seeing.
Yeah, it was just last year, oil and gas accounted for 28% of national emissions. Now it's 31%. So we kind of seem to be going backwards, at least the industry doesn't seem to be pulling its weight.
Yeah, as other sectors are making progress, of course, that percent that is coming from the oil and gas sector is increasing, as you point out.
Okay, let's talk about the oil sands, which is almost entirely situated in Alberta. And in 2022, I think it's fair to say that if you go back to 1990, the data, the emissions data just steadily rises. It didn't fall last year. It is now at, last year was 84.3 megatons a year. And sorry, that was 2022. The year before it was like, a half or 1 megaton lower. And the issue here, it seems to me, and I've looked through this data fairly thoroughly, as long as the supply of oil, of bitumen, keeps going up, the absolute emissions overwhelm the improvements in emissions intensity per barrel. And the problem here is the Alberta Energy Regulator is forecasting another 600,000 barrels per day of production by 2032. So that's only 8 years away. And it's very hard to see how the oil sands will bring down their emissions intensity per barrel enough that that extra supply doesn't lead to higher absolute emissions from the sector. Your comments.
Yes, I think you're right. The emissions intensity in the past few years sort of flattened. So that's why we need a big step change, right? We need the step change that an oil and gas cap would bring and associated with the Pathways Alliance commitment. Because as it stands right now, I think, that industry has made, the incremental improvements that they could make on their own. And as you point out, the number will continue to increase as we move forward.
MC, this is not a pushback. This is a clarification. It's my argument. And I know you're an engineer, you spent many years in the oil and gas industry. And I would argue that, in fact, the industry has not done very much at all. I remember 2016, 2017, I was interviewing experts around solvent substitution. So instead of burning natural gas to make steam, which is where the majority of the oil sands emissions come from, they would use light hydrocarbons as a substitute for steam to soften up the oil so that the bitumen so they could extract it. And here we are 7, 8 years later, and the only company that's rolled this out in any to any degree is your old employer, Imperial Oil, and only really in a very small project. And I have trouble feeling sorry and sympathetic towards this industry that really is not putting in the capital expenditures to implement programs like this that have the potential to bring down those emissions. They're just not serious about it, is my conclusion. And I think the data that we're looking at today basically proves my point.
Yeah, I use the word, incremental, but yeah, it's been the improvement opportunities that are economically feasible. It's not been the large scale improvements that we need to see. And that's why, we think, again, that an emissions cap is required, strengthening the industrial carbon pricing is required. There's policy interventions that are required at this point.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that this is a case where the industry will not do anything of note unless it is required to by the regulator. And this has happened in other areas where the industry is operating. They wait for government to tell them what to do, and then they do it. And in this case, the government is dragging its feet. Now, that's my editorial comment. I'm not going to ask you to respond to that. But let's talk about methane, because this is, I think, the numbers that stood out the most to me, because Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has gone on record as saying that as of 2023, the province has already reduced fugitive methane emissions from gas production by 45%. And she's resisting efforts by the federal government to raise that to 75%. But when I look at these numbers, I don't see 45%. So as an example, in 2009, there were 56.3 megatons a year of emissions. And in 2022, 45.9. That's only a 19% decline. And I know the premier, in fairness to the premier, I was on the Alberta Energy Regulator website. I saw the graph, I saw the data that they provided to her, and it said 45%. But this data does not support that at all. And do you have any insights into where that disconnect comes from?
Not clear insight, but I can speak to, I think, a few factors that are leading to this disconnect. So I think with respect to what's been published in the NRI, you probably know that there has been a significant upwards adjustment to all the methane emissions number for all of the years. This was caused by a couple of reasons. Using actual atmospheric concentration numbers that the government has collected versus, the emissions calculations that we have been typically doing. They've changed the global warming potential of the methane. So again, that has adjusted all of the numbers upwards. And so now we're not comparing apples to apples anymore. That's one thing. Secondly, I think it's fair to say that the AER Alberta calculates methane emissions differently than how the federal government calculates it. So unfortunately, this is leading to confounding factors not being able to compare apples to apples. And it could be also, not being able to ascertain whether this 45% is overestimated or not, right?
MC, there's been a lot of studies that have been released in the last, well, actually for a number of years. I think I ran across my first one in 2015 in Texas, Barnett Shale Field, and that the fugitive methane emissions are underestimated, and by a factor of at least 1.5 to 2. And in the last few years, we've seen some of these studies being done in Canada. And we know, for instance, that BC is very clean. It has a very low leak rate, but Alberta has a much higher leak rate. Saskatchewan is the absolute worst. Its rate was very, very high. And so the question is, this upward revision in the numbers that you're talking about, is that revision coming out of these studies? And if it is, as we do more studies and we get more accurate technology like methane sniffing satellites and remote sensing, is it likely that we're going to see further revisions in the future?
Right. I'm not familiar with all of the studies that you referenced, Markham, but yes, the current upwards revision that was done for 2022 data is based on some studies that have been done in Canada. And so as we move forward in time, as better technology is used and available to measure methane emissions, I think we should expect other revisions and a better understanding of how much methane, the industry is emitting.
Yeah, it's maybe we'll close off this interview with just a brief discussion of who has jurisdiction here. At the end of the day, the federal government has put in place, thresholds. They've negotiated equivalency agreements with Alberta under the industrial emitters tax, carbon tax. All of those are good, but really, the federal government is limited in what it can require industry to do. At the end of the day, if it wants to have industry lower emissions more quickly, it really needs the cooperation of the provincial government. Am I correct in that?
I think that is the most efficient way to proceed. If, for example, Alberta was to not seek equivalency with the proposed regulation, that would not preclude the federal government from regulating, but it would become very inefficient and probably not lead to the outcomes we're looking for because they don't have the infrastructure to regulate, for example, in Alberta today. So, provincial cooperation is the most efficient. It's the most advantageous to get us to the emissions reduction in the most timely manner.
Yeah, sure. I hear that from the industry all the time. Don't give me two sets of regulations. Don't make me, report and comply twice instead of once. It's very confusing and it costs a lot of money. Fair enough on that. And I guess my point is the conclusion would be that Alberta has to step up. There more has to be done by the province to get the oil to force the oil and gas industry to spend the money to reduce these emissions. But MC, thank you very much. This has been a very useful overview and dive into the data that was released today.
My pleasure.